Otra de las instancias propuestas en este Blockchain Summit Global son los Fireside Chat. En este caso vamos a tener esta actividad en inglés. Vamos a ir al contacto con Jonathan Holt y David Koepsell. Welcome. Are you there?
We are. Thank you.
Thank
Howdy.
you. Can you hear me? Everything is fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ok, bueno, les voy a presentar a quienes están escuchándonos en español, si bien esta conferencia, este diálogo va a ser en inglés. A Jonathan Holt es Chief Medical Informatics Officer en Consensys Health, y tenemos a David Koepsell, General Counsel, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, Latin American Market Leader, Consensys Health. Well, we are hearing you. Welcome.
Thank you
Howdy.
so much. Shall we introduce ourselves, Jonathan, and before we have a little chat about digital ID?
Yeah, sure thing. Why don't you go first?
Sure. So thank you again for the introduction. I'm David Koepsell, and I am a former philosophy professor and lawyer, and now Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer and General Counsel for Consensys Health, and the founder also of Encryption, which is a genomic data exchange. So my interest in the question surrounding digital ID center around some of the regulatory and ethical issues. Jonathan has a deep background in it as well. Why don't you introduce yourself, Jonathan?
Sure. So Jonathan Holt, I am a triple board certified physician. So I'm boarded in internal medicine, clinical genetics, and clinical informatics. So after medical school, I did my training in Kaiser in San Francisco, did a residency in internal medicine, then genetics at UCSF, and then I was on faculty at Stanford University for a while doing primary care before working as a geneticist at Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco. Then finished my training at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, doing clinical informatics as my master's degree. And then stayed on faculty for 3 years, teaching students in biomedical informatics, and saw patients in clinical genetics, mostly in adult genetics. This is my background. Before leaving to do a startup company called SeqTech Diagnostics, which is a genetic testing lab. We at first started working on tissue tumor profiling with treatment selection for chemotherapy and a lung cancer panel that we actually created. And I created all the bioinformatics pipelines for identifying the variants. Unfortunately, we didn't get sufficient funding to actually go through the whole FDA approval process for our assay. So we decided to focus on food testing, which is actually, it's a fascinating use of technology of clinical next-gen sequencing in identifying food fraud. So I'm still on the board as an advisor, but we do genetic testing for genetically modified organisms, as well as differentiating between ingredient identification. Mostly for our customers, the number one customer is actually dog food. So we actually do genetic sequencing of kibbles of mystery meat, and I can quantify how much of it is beef versus pig versus donkey versus horse versus mystery meat. And so I created a lot of the bioinformatics pipelines. But that was back in 2015 and 16. And then this really, what captivated my attention was not really blockchain specifically, but in this concept of verifiable of truth. Because in the end, our customers were supply chain management. Pet food manufacturers who are supplying their sources from suppliers in, let's say, New Zealand, in lamb, for instance. If you're paying premium for kibbles of lamb, but you're getting back mystery meat that wasn't lamb. So we did genetic testing for them. But in the end, the problem we were trying to solve for our customers really was about information provenance, that some genetic testing had been done somewhere in the supply chain. And how do you present that proof of manifest, that testing, that sampling of the supply had been performed, and presenting that as part of the manifest for the receiving of the shipment. And so we did do a lot of retrospective quality assurance processes for our customers. But by the time our test came back, it was the barge filled of kibbles of mystery meat was already unloaded, and so it was not helpful for sort of turning around and denying acceptance of that shipment.
Sure.
So what captivated my attention really was in the issuance of this manifest, and how do you actually do that cryptographically and as a presentation of proof. And that got me interested in blockchain technology actually to facilitate. And so we built some blockchain solutions into our pipeline, mostly just hashing of PDF documents into Bitcoin at the time. But that got me interested in blockchain technologies, and not to mention, how do you manage, I have a database filled with 55,000 genomes of species. So how do you manage that? And that got me into a cryptographic identifier for storage it into our distributed databases, and how to actually help to differentiate that.
So yeah, we both have interests in truth from different perspectives. So as a philosopher, my training is focused also upon ways we get to know things and how we can be assured of truth. Epistemology is a significant percentage of what we do in philosophy. But I also became interested in the problem of how we can give individuals access to claims. So it turned, I about 20 years ago, I became interested in the work of Hernando de Soto, who's a Peruvian economist. And one of the things that I found compelling about his work is that he did a lot of study about why there's poverty in the world, why people don't have access to the wealth they're sitting on, or they're generating or using. And it turns out a couple billion of us have no proof of who we are. And this is a cause of poverty. So he calls this trapped capital or dead capital. Essentially, the very poorest of the poor all over the world may be sitting on land that they've used and they've improved and they've been farming, et cetera. But there's no good proof for them that they own it. And therefore, they really can't realize the value of that capital. This is also applicable to the work you're doing on genetics. Our access to proof claims about ourselves and to the value and the wealth that is involved in those claims and those resources is, I think we both agree, and our work is focused on a real problem for individuals. So the solving issues of identity has been complicated I live in Mexico City, so when I purchased a home here, I saw that the chain of title situations here are very different than they are in the United States, where there are some more sophisticated, but still largely paper-based records of ownership. But even preceding these records of land ownership are questions about ownership of, thank you, my assistant, questions of ownership of ourselves. How do you prove that you are you? If you need to participate in an economy, if you need to participate in your health, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are you. So this relates to genetics, of course, but even more basically to our participation in society. So why do you think blockchain is one of the solutions that can help us to bridge those gaps?
Yeah, so I've been spending a lot of time in the last 2-3 years working on something called verifiable credentials. And this is work coming out of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and the DIF, the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And this is the sort of like the triad of a holder of an identity, the issuer of identifying information, and the verifiers. And this has like this idea of self-sovereignty, which is actually I'm in control over my own identity. And I like bring your own identity to the place. You're not given an identity. You can basically associate your own identity. And I think, so a lot of the, this work comes from if people are familiar with the DOI, the Document Object Identifier, this is basically Robert Kahn, who was the early inventor of the internet, is now the DOI Foundation, which is based in Switzerland. And it really,
So
if people are
when people look up library records, for instance, they'll see the
so ISBN, so the International Society for Book Numbering, is basically like from the DOI, your issue, you too can actually create your own random number for, let's say, your genome. Actually, we're going to create a whole split from instead of ISBN, it'll be basically genomic numbering. And basically now you're given a number from like some federated numbering issue. But the self-sovereign approach really is that has to do with random numbers. And those random numbers could be associated with cryptographic public keys. And that into proving your identity is basically really proving that you are in control over that random sort of random number associated with cryptography. And that is actually suddenly it's empowered people to have their own identifier. And identity really is a process of correlation of names, attributes, my eye color, my social security number, or my national provider identifier for physicians, or my name, my date of birth, my address. Those are all like attributes that define me. But it's really, we're getting away from this, especially with things like the Equifax hack or other sort of surveillance capitalism, people using my identity to make money off of me. Really, it's the idea of that I own my own identity, and I'm bringing that to the table. So, and really, it just happens to be just random. These are not really random numbers. They're random numbers associated with cryptography. And that now in the W3C, the DIDs, the decentralized identifiers, there's about 67 different methods that you can actually use to actually as an identifier and present that and have claims issued against that. So this is an evolving technology, and it really, I think, is going to be empowering this idea of self-sovereignty. And part of the struggle, though, is the biometrics. So either your fingerprint, your face, or your genome is actually to prove ownership of you are you, is how do you associate your identifiers, including some of the biometrics. Now, the challenges of blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology is that your biometrics don't change. At least the good biometrics don't change over time. And so if we use those into the blockchain, that there is a concern that that can be correlated across your different personas. So I'm not going to have one single identifier to identify me. I'm going to have multiple, and I'm going to use ones to, I might not use all the same identifiers for my bank or my telephone company or my healthcare record, but I'm going to show the ones that are relevant so that you can have something called selective disclosure. That basically let's say I just need to prove that I'm over the age of 21 to buy alcohol. Like no one needs to know where I live or track me, like if I'm buying alcohol, or so it's all they need to know is that I meet the metric as far as I'm over the age of 21. And that's it. And so you don't need to share your whole genome with someone when you're going to the marketplace to buy, a bottle of wine. So I think so. This is where I think the issues of privacy and but then identity really is the correlation of your your attributes that define you. That is the process of identity. That basically we can reconcile your name, your address, and certain attributes and we associate that. An identifier is basically just a helpful way of aggregating those and attaching assertions of name, address, date of birth, and other things like biometrics to that.
And so one of the things that we're worried about is, blockchains are good at making things public. They're really not good at making things private.
Right.
And one of the misconceptions about blockchains is that it's a method of preserving privacy. There has to be some intermediating technology involved if you're interested in preserving privacy. But identity is something that is also necessarily public. So I often think of PGP. Remember, and this is a fine technology where you have a public key and you have a private key, and you can transmit information as long as you have the public key in an encrypted way to your recipient only. are these the sorts of transactions that we're going to be using in order to be able to prove our identities without revealing our identities?
Yep, and certainly in the PGP, pretty good protection is a great example. And also the challenges of that technology. That's been around for 25, 30 plus years. And it's mostly people who are not familiar with it. It's actually for encrypting email. And there's usually a key server. MIT has one, for instance, where you publish your public key. The challenge with that is that how do you keep all of those key rotations in sync? And I know at least one of my earlier PGP keys is still, I never put in expiration dates from 1998. And so the challenge is that I've since lost the private key, and so that one's still out in this key server as being valid. So, but I've smartened up and actually in how to rotate my keys. And so that actually is the foundation of this verifiable credentials and the decentralized identifiers is creating a distributed public key infrastructure for reconciling, resolving, and fetching these public keys without a central source of web server that could go down or be falsified or have a whole bunch of man-in-the-middle attacks. So this is really sort of actually is to help bootstrap the web of trust that PGP started with, and to create these decentralized ways of fetching those public keys. And so that's where the decentralized identifier, and the DID document, the keys and the metadata that actually associated with the cryptographic keys. But the verifiable credentials actually are supposed to live off-chain. In fact, we're having a big debate right now is what belongs in this DID document, including like service endpoints of how to contact me. And in itself is ways of correlating you. Let's say you're using a server and basically you have an identifier, and suddenly actually protected personal information is actually like suddenly in that DID document where it's not supposed to. So we're trying to keep everything that's private off chain, and everything that's really is these verifiable credentials, which is that maybe I can show you with a QR code, or I can send it to you. And basically I'm sharing you those attributes and those associations of my name, my date of birth, whatever is necessary for our transaction. But none of that actually belongs on chain. And even there's a debate maybe that the hash of that information doesn't even belong on chain.
Yeah, so how tightly do we have to fit biometrics into this is what I wonder. Because again, when you are using biometrics, you run the risk of leaking personal information, depending on the type of biometrics. So
yeah,
what are your thoughts?
So we had a whole discussion about this. And so right now, the verifiable credential and the decentralized identifier is going through security audit with the W3C. And I was on the committee to help review that recommendation. And the dilemma is that in the current draft of the specification, biometrics is included in the DID document as a method of verifying that you are in control over the private key. And so I think we're trying to push that all into verifiable credentials that are off-chain and outside the DID document, because and mostly the validation, the how do I authenticate as being me? And there's different methods. Right now, public key infrastructure is that I basically assign some cryptographic hash that basically proves that I am ownership of the private key associated with that public key. So it really is this asymmetric encryption, or asymmetric signature of that I'm proving ownership over the private key. And if people aren't familiar with I'm blanking on the guy's name who's in Australia, who's pretending to be Satoshi Nakamoto, and it keeps on coming out that he can't produce a signature, a valid signature of Satoshi Nakamoto. And so he's yeah, so I think this is sort of like the solution, which is that you authenticate over by basically signing some piece of payload and to verify that. And there was some discussion about using biometrics to do that authentication as well, but we're trying to actually keep this right now in the realm of public key, private key signatures. And then there's also whole dilemmas about that because, the encryption and cryptography has a shelf life. So as we get quantum computers, for instance, certain things like RSA encryption in 1024 is basically don't use that. They use at least 2048 or higher for 4096 bit encryption. because they're quantum immune or resistant, and maybe you still have like a shelf life of 10 years. But any information that we store on chain, even encrypted, has a shelf life depending on how fast our computers actually catch up and to help break that encryption. So we're trying to really put everything off chain as much as possible in private data vaults. And that gets me into something that we're working on now is something called encrypted data vaults or secure data stores. I don't think we've actually picked a name yet. And this is also coming out of the W3C and the DIF, the Decentralized Identifier Foundation, Identity Foundation. And it's really about where do we store my stuff? And how do I actually securely share that with you, including things like my genome? So how do I, like, for instance, like the verifiable credentials, maybe I have that in a wallet, my phone, but how do I synchronize it with an agent in the cloud and actually give you access, permission access to see certain attributes about myself, including things about my genome? And, there's a lot of people who are doing this healthcare specific or genomic specific methodologies, but I'm actually of the viewpoint that it is healthcare is just one small slice of a broader ecosystem of my digital identity, including like my playlist for my music, my movies. So, like I've got, God, at least my kids have thousands of dollars worth of Barbie movies, and like I've purchased over the years that actually, like I have like a subscription, or I have some identity that actually associated with purchasing that content. And it really gets into like, well, how do I store that? How do I securely share that? And how do I know who has actually had access to it? So that has to do the next piece of this, which is once you like authenticate using like DID authentication, it's really how do you authorize someone to have access to bits of my information, including things like genome. In the past, in the health information exchanges, we did talk about using, rather than bring the data to the algorithm, bring the algorithm to the data. And this is like the next piece of this is once we actually get encrypted data vaults, including like things like homomorphic encryption or encrypted indices, which actually I can query certain parts of, let's say, like the genome, rather than download it all to you, because genomes can be quite large. It's flipping it, which is I'm going to bring the algorithm to the data, perform some computation, and do verified compute on that bit of data and get extracted information. So I don't really have to have the burden of downloading a genome and managing that. And I'm not sure if people are familiar in the US, we have HIPAA laws as far as patient privacy. I know in South America, at least in Brazil, there is the General Data Protection Law, which is actually very similar to the GDPR protection in Europe, as far as like a bunch of laws regulating access and storage of personal information. And so that would be the same thing. And I think the technology may facilitate this in interesting ways of actually of accessing the information, securely verifying the compute on that information, and giving derived data without having to worry about actually handling the toxic waste, which is like protected health information.
So one of the things that poses a challenge to that is if you do enough computes on that data, you can start to extract meaningful data. You might be limited in an individual query, but if you do enough queries, you can start to extract a good subset of the data that sits in place. So it's not a magic bullet, but it's certainly one of the things in the tool chest.
Yeah. And that had, like, for instance, given about 17 specific points on your Y chromosome, I can probably say with about 90% certainty what your last name is. And so I think, so there is just, you're right, certain areas of the genome that we would enlighten us, or being able to query across families. For instance, like, I'm not about you, but my relatives are fascinated with things like ancestry.com, and they've done all this genetic testing. I'm actually a clinical geneticist, and I've actually never had any genetic testing done on myself. So it's but my family has, and I'm sure, like, if you can correlate my identity across my family members who've done testing in these different repositories. So how do we protect that? And it's hard because I think the horse is out of the barn already.
I think it is too. So we have a few minutes left. I wonder if, if you want to, first of all, I'll say I think that we're always going to be in the trade-off between making this information as available as possible for us to be able to function as members of economies. In order to do transactions now, the various payment and settlement systems out there know a fair amount of each of us already. And there's no way you can get that genie back in the bottle. But in order to make sure that we future-proof our identities and create some security in our ability to be able to participate in economies and science, et cetera, and health, we obviously need to do more. Do you think what is the most likely thing we'll see for digital identity in the next 5 years, would you say?
Well, I think hopefully we're going to finish the verifiable credential and the decentralized identifier specification. And I think, and already I know in South America, there's FinID, which is coming out of Brazil, certainly for financial information and attaching that to banking information where you, and I think FinID is actually partnering with Sovereign, if I'm familiar. And that Sovereign is being one of these companies that are actually working with decentralized identity. And but really, I think that I think is still just a few years old, and I think it's hopefully going to get traction on that and really get adoption in the next 5 years. But then I think it's still going to be the encrypted data stores of actually places, decentralized ways of actually storing all your information, including your genomic, your health information, and then you're actually really creating a marketplace for that. And I think So for instance, one thing I'm working on is verifiable vaccinations, and we're running out of time, and I don't have time to tell you how excited I am about the work we're doing with COVID-19 in validated laboratory tests and the verifiable vaccinations to do knowledge discovery at scale across borders, to do registries of disease, registries of immunization, who people actually respond well to having a vaccination, and actually how do we close that loop and actually perform a learning healthcare system so we can all learn about things like the efficacy of a vaccine against COVID-19 in the context of strain identification. So this actually isn't about genomic about you, it's about the genome of the virus that you actually happen to have, and how do we actually know that the immunity is for that specific strain of the virus. Again, having access to that in a way that's distributed and decentralized to facilitate knowledge discovery is right at the cutting edge.
I agree with you. Yeah, no, I thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to our hosts.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to have you here. Jonathan Holt y David Koepsell, entonces, compartiendo con nosotros este Fireside Chat.